Welcome to Tales from the Fireside by Rodeo Whiter and Dan Lee, a collection of grim tales to light your way through the long dark of winter.
Ah, I wondered if you would be joining us tonight. Well, don't just stand there. Close the door, shut out the bitter cold. Come, sit, for the story is just about to begin.
Moving day is an important day for every family. For the Lasts, it was no different. They had been waiting for this day for a long time. Jonathan Last, father to Lucy, the firstborn, and Edward, the younger, and husband to Michelle, had been trying to get a transfer to the country for a while now. He once loved the hustle of London. However, when Lucy was born, he applied to move to his company's Oxford offices. It took a few years, but he finally got there, and just in time for Lucy to start secondary school. Edward's turn in a couple of years. They had bought a house in the suburbs of Oxford. It was an old English house full of nooks and hideaways for the children to play. The front door opened into an amazing space. To the right was the living room, cosy sofas covered in cushions, all pointed around the fireplace, and to the left the kitchen and the dining room. The rear kitchen doors led out into the expansive back garden, which in turn led down to the river, and in the centre of the ground floor the staircase leading up to their bedrooms, all with the arched windows and incredible views of either their picturesque suburban road or the River Thames at the back of their house. The removal men had just finished bringing in the last sofa. Michelle offered them a cup of tea, and they willingly accepted. The two children had already ran off to explore the house, leaving Michelle and the removal men in the dining room, surrounded by a jungle of boxes and eagerly huddled around a plate of biscuits. Michelle's husband, Jonathan, was still in London for the next few days. He still had some work he had to finish and loose ends to tie up before he started his new life. Jonathan used to live around Oxford before he moved to the big city. He always wanted to move to London, but his wife at the time didn't want to move. After a year or so of arguing, they filed for divorce and went their separate ways. Jonathan went to London and shortly met Michelle, and his then wife stayed in Oxford. Michelle was planning on having the majority of the house finished and ready for when Jonathan came up in 3 days. She at least wanted everything to be unboxed and in its correct place. "Nice place you've got here," said one of the men, looking around and nodding. "Thank you. We were actually quite lucky to get it. Apparently it hasn't been on the market long, and its previous owner wanted a quick sale," replied Michelle. After the removal men had been suitably nourished, they left. Michelle was now standing in a sea of cardboard boxes, hands on hips, and looking around at the overwhelming task that lay ahead. "Well, better get started," she said to herself. The sunny autumnal late morning turned into a cloudy afternoon and into a beautiful dusk settling over the famous spires. Michelle had almost finished unboxing. The last thing to do were the kids' bedrooms, but she thought she might leave those until the next day. They had a bed to sleep in, and that was enough for now. That night, Michelle suddenly realised how late it was and thought she'd better get dinner for Lucy and Edward. She made her way around the house, calling their names. No response. She tried upstairs in each of the bedrooms. Nothing. She went out to the back garden. Nothing. She suddenly felt a rush of fear wash over her as she remembered the river at the bottom of the garden. She ran down to the river, frantically calling their names. Still no response. She arrived at the water's edge. No children to be seen. Michelle didn't know what to do. Should she jump in? The water would be freezing, and trying to find them in that water would be impossible. She carried on calling their names out across the water, hoping they would appear. "Mum, what is it?" Lucy had poked her head out from behind one of the bushes. Michelle darted over to Lucy and threw her arms around her. "Where's your brother?" Lucy pointed to another bush, and Edward's head was poking out. He was smiling and waving. Michelle had never felt a sense of relief like this before. "Come over here, Eddie." Edward made his way over the soggy grass. Their mum knelt down in front of them both. "I don't want you coming this far without me, do you understand?" "Okay, Mum," replied Eddie. Michelle looked at Lucy, and she looked at the ground. "But I can swim," said Lucy, knowing what the response was going to be. It doesn't matter. It's very cold around this time of year. I don't want you near this river without me, okay? You have plenty of other garden to play in. If you want to come down here, come and get me first. Is that understood? Yeah, okay, replied Lucy, still looking at the ground and pouting, in a not-so-futile attempt to get sympathy. Right then, I can't be bothered to cook tonight, so why don't we go to the chip shop? The children cheered, and holding their mother's hands, they all went back up to the house. Michelle took them down the road to the local chip shop. They had a portion of chips each, and almost raced back to the house. Michelle put the key in the lock and turned the key. She then noticed that the bedroom light was on. "Come on, Mum. I don't like it when my chips get too soggy," said Edward as he was tugging at his mum's sleeve. "Did either of you leave a light on?" "We've been in the garden all day," replied Lucy. "Have you been upstairs?" "Nope." Lucy was now starting to feel a little uncomfortable. "Come on, Mum." Michelle unlocked the door and they both ran and jumped on the sofas. "You two start, I'm just going to turn that light off." Michelle discreetly grabbed a knife from the kitchen as to not alarm the children, and slowly made her way upstairs, eyes fixed through the gloom on the door to the room from which the light was emanating. With every step up the stairs, her hand got tighter around the knife's grip, every step accompanied by louder and louder squeaks from old wooden stairs, every breath getting shorter and louder. She put her hand on the door handle and slowly turned, flinching at the sounds of the latch inside the door pulling back. When she could turn no further, she took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Nothing. No light. No one in the room. Just Lucy's bed and a mirror. Michelle explored the room to the extent someone could explore an almost empty room. She knew the room was empty, but it didn't feel empty. Then out of the corner of her eye, a rush in the shadows in the mirror. She looked around the room. She looked back at the mirror, knife held even tighter. Still nothing to be seen. "Mum, your chips are getting cold." Michelle heard Edward's voice calling up the stairs. "Okay, just coming," she called back. She slowly backed out of the room and made her way down the stairs. She smiled to the children, partly to assure them that she and everything was fine, but mainly as a reaction of seeing that they were fine. The family sat down and enjoyed their chips. They laughed into the night, telling stories and talking until Edward fell asleep, and Lucy had started to yawn every few seconds. Michelle carried Edward up to his room and told Lucy to get into bed. She'll be along in a minute. She put Eddie in bed and tucked him in, drew his curtains and shut the door, then went into Lucy's room. Lucy was sat bolt upright on her bed, staring at the corner of the room. She looked like she was in some sort of trance. "Lucy? Lucy? What is it? What's wrong?" Michelle tried looking in the corner of the room, but she couldn't see anything. She sat on the edge of Lucy's bed. "Can't you see, Mummy?" asked Lucy. "See what?" Lucy raised her finger and pointed into the corner. "Why is he smiling at me?" The room suddenly turned very cold. Michelle was horrified at what might be behind her, and she didn't want to turn around to find out, but she had to. Slowly she turned her head to see nothing. She then turned back to Lucy, jumped back and almost fell off the bed. Lucy's eyes were pitch black and she was smiling. The skin around her mouth had turned a greyish blue and cracked. She spoke with a stolen voice that came out of her mouth but didn't require her to move her lips. "Get out!" Lucy then twitched her head back towards a corner of the room. Michelle looked round. Nothing was there. She looked back at Lucy and she had returned to normal. "Are you okay, Mum?" Michelle was completely lost for words. What had she just seen? Did she even see it at all? "I'm fine. Try and get some sleep." Michelle, shaking, brushed Lucy's hair back and wished her a good night. She then retired to her room. Everything seemed normal and non-threatening. It took her a while to get to sleep, but after convincing herself that she must have imagined it or fell asleep for a short while, she was out until the sun rose. The next day. They all awoke late morning. Michelle couldn't sleep due to the thought of the stalking shadow that lurked in her daughter's room. Lucy had a very restless night, plagued with nightmares, none of which she could remember. And Edward, it turns out, didn't sleep at all. He spent his night shaking under the covers, cowering from the whispers coming within the walls. The chances are it could have been mice that had gotten through a split in the wall and were making a nest for winter. However, after seeing what seemed to be blood dripping from the electrical sockets, the theory that it was mice didn't stand up to scrutiny, even to the imagination of a 9-year-old. At one point during the night he looked out from under the duvet at his alarm clock. It read 2:10 in the morning, the 8th of October 2018. That was when he heard the scratching and the whispers coming from within the walls. Back under the covers he hid until the noise had stopped. Poking his head out again, maybe 5 minutes later, he looked again at his alarm clock. 2:15, 8th of October, 1998. This couldn't be right. The fear had vanished and Edward was now distracted by the date. He looked around the room. It had changed. The wallpaper, once old and tired and tearing itself from the wall, now looked pristine and new. Laughter could be heard from down the hall, child's laughter. His room was now decorated with everything that could make a house a home. A thick fluffy rug on the floor, a wardrobe full of colourful clothes, toys scattered around, generally a happy place to be. Edward felt quite at home. With a newfound confidence surging through his veins, he wanted to explore the rest of the house. Edward arose from the bed and the covers relaxed. Above the bed were hand-carved wooden animals, fastened to the wall. From the ceiling a model of a hot air balloon hung. Edward made his way to the door and poked his head precariously around the doorframe. A brightly lit hallway filled with life, happiness and laughter. 2 children sat at the end of the hallway playing. Edward didn't see them as any kind of threat, so he walked up to them and asked if he could play too. They obliged, and Edward sat down with them. One was playing with some cars, and the other brushing a doll's hair. "So where did you come from?" Edward asked, but no response. "My name's Edward, but most people call me Eddie. What are your names?" Still no response. Eddie was going to reach for one of the cars so he could join in, but he stopped, and all the fear he felt before came flooding back. He'd noticed the boy's fingernails turned black, his skin grey with cracked veins coursing up his arm. He was pressing on the toy car harder and harder, gouging tyre tracks into the wooden floorboards. The girl looked the same. She was brushing the hair, harder and harder. Hairs were being wrenched from the doll's head. The doll had suddenly aged about 20 years. The paint was flaking off, and the colours had faded. Eddie wanted to run away, but he was frozen to the spot. He couldn't move from sheer terror. He still couldn't see the children's faces. He didn't want to either. An unseen force threw Eddie down the hall. It was violent, like he had been picked up by a giant and bowled down an alley. He looked up at the children, and they were standing up, facing him. Their eyes black, skin grey and cracked, blood dribbling from their grinning mouths, and only in contact of the floor by the very tips of their shoes. They started gliding towards Eddie, their shoes scraping against the wood, their hands held out to the sides, scraping down the walls, leaving scratch marks all the way down. Eddie stumbled back as far as he could go, the children still coming towards him. "Leave me alone," Eddie shouted through his tears. "Leave me alone, I didn't do anything to you."
"You're going to die in this house."
The children, with their smiling faces, were getting ever closer. Eddie could only close his eyes and hope. Thump, thump. Dull but loud thuds echoed up the hall. Eddie closed his eyes even tighter. Then more dull thuds. Gradually the thuds turned into wet thuds, and then squelching. The bodies were being beaten and bludgeoned into the walls by an unknown and unseen force. Maybe the same force that shunted him down the hall earlier. Whatever it was, he was thankful for it. After more thuds and more sounds of flesh being pounded through the wall, there was nothing left apart from the doll and the car on the floor. The bodies had been pulped into nothing more than a bloodstain on the walls, dripping down to the floor. Eddie ran back to his bedroom and hid under the covers. He quickly looked out to make sure that no one had followed him, but when he did look out, the room had reverted back to his old room, and the alarm clock read the 8th of October, 2018. "Mum! Mum!" Eddie ran down the stairs crying to Michelle, who was on the phone to Jonathan. "Mum, I saw something. I saw some children. They were trying to get me." He ran up to his mum and wrapped his arms around her and squeezed her as tight as he could. Michelle had a sudden realization that what she had seen had in fact been real, if Eddie had seen the same thing too. "I have to go, John. I'll speak to you later." Michelle put the phone down on the side and pried Eddie from her legs. She knelt down in front of him. "What did you see, Eddie?" It was two children. They tried to get me." "Can you remember what they looked like, Eddie?" "They had black eyes and—" Silence seemed to fall on the mother and child, and time stood still for just a split second. "And I think they were dead. Mum, I found this." Lucy's voice broke the thick silence from across the kitchen. Michelle and Eddie looked over to Lucy, stood in the doorway. She was holding an old doll's head with half of its hair pulled out. "Where did you find that?" Michelle rushed over to Lucy. "I found it in the hallway upstairs." All three looked up to where the hallway passed over their heads, and a red circle was growing and getting darker. Then it dripped, and it kept dripping. Michelle grabbed Eddie's and Lucy's hands and led them outside into the back garden. "Okay, I don't care what happens, you are not allowed back in there, do you understand? Now I'm just going to quickly go back in and try and find out what that red stuff is, okay?" Michelle was doing a great job of hiding her tears from her children. "I think it was blood, Mum." Lucy's voice once again broke that imaginary safety blanket that Michelle and Eddie were trying to grasp onto. "Just stay here." Michelle went back inside. Eddie tried to follow her, but Lucy pulled him back. "Mum said to wait here," she said to her younger brother. Michelle slowly opened the door. It screamed with creaks. She looked up at the ceiling. The red patch was still there, dripping onto the cream-tiled floor. She edged around the growing puddle and started to make her way upstairs. Each step squeaked and twisted underfoot. She got up to the hallway and found nothing. No blood, no children, no unwanted spectres. It was her hallway of her house. She checked the bedrooms and the bathroom. Empty. Michelle felt a little bit more relaxed. She looked out of the bedroom window down at Eddie and Lucy to make sure they were all right. Michelle's heart dropped to a darkened pit. The two children were stood behind Eddie and Lucy. All four were looking up into the house at the window where Michelle stood. All four had the same smile. All four had black eyes. In unison they all turned round and started walking away. Michelle realised they were walking towards the river. She ran down the stairs and tried to get out of the back door. It was locked, or being held shut by that unknown violent force. This wasn't going to stop her. She kept charging at the door with her shoulder until the door broke into 4 different pieces and she could climb through the remnants. She ran down the garden, following the path of the 4 children, through the bushes, and there on the water's edge, Eddie and Lucy. She lunged over and grabbed them both, just as they were stepping off the embankment. "Mum, what happened?" The children were confused, as if waking from a coma. Michelle couldn't speak through the tears. All 3 made their way back up the garden and into the house. "I thought you said we couldn't go back in." Lucy was always the first to ask questions if something didn't make sense to her. "You're both staying with me. They don't seem to like it when we're all together. They like to get us when we're vulnerable. They're trying to scare us, and they're not going to." Michelle's tone had changed from scared to plain angry. She was adamant that no one was going to harm her children. The three went into the sitting room and sat down, cuddled up on the sofa, and said nothing. They wanted to enjoy the reclaimed safety. "Right," said Michelle, breaking the silence with that one sledgehammer of a word. "We're going to do something. Dad will be here soon. Let's play a game. Any suggestions?" Neither Eddie or Lucy felt scared anymore. They found great comfort in the fact that their mum wasn't going to take any more from the ghosts. Michelle got up and knelt down in front of the TV cabinet where she had put the games the night before. "So which one's it going to be? Pictionary? Cluedo?"
I have my own game to play.
That voice again. Michelle turned around and saw Eddie and Lucy, heads flopped back, hovering in the centre of the room, and the children's ghosts stood on the stairs. "Don't hurt us." The children spoke. They weren't smiling anymore. Their faces were sullen, still black-eyed, grey cracked skin, but they spoke. The voice was different from the other voice Michelle had heard. They were also looking up. Michelle took a few steps closer to the children. "I'm not going to hurt you. Why are you trying to hurt me and my children?" Michelle now felt like she could talk to the children. "We just wanted to play. But we died." "Did you die in the river? Did you fall in?" "That's what everybody thought." The house quaked, almost knocking Michelle off balance. "What happened to you?" "Our mother was pushed into the river. We saw what happened and tried to jump in and save her. Our father pulled us out. He was mad." The house quaked again and the living room wall cracked. Blood started to pour from the cut in the wall. "Did your father hurt you?" The children replied with a nod. "Did your father do this to you?" Another nod from the children.
You will die here.
The house started to quake again, and this time it didn't stop. The walls were cracking all around Michelle. She tried to pull Lucy and Eddie, but they were fixed in their suspended sleep. "Please don't hurt us," Michelle pleaded with the unknown force. "Mother is angry. She cannot rest with her children until they have been found." The house started to crack even more. Bits of the ceiling were falling down. One bit of rubble caught Michelle on the head and cut the side of her face. She started to feel slightly dizzy and faint. She was struggling to focus on what was around her. She knew what would happen if she gave up now. Then she remembered the blood patch. That's where the bodies must be. She ran upstairs and saw the same as Eddie that morning. 2 blood stains on the walls. The house quaked again, and she fell against one of the red stains on the walls. The blood had softened the plasterboard, and her hand went straight through. Another quake, and her foot went through the floor. She pulled herself up and started tearing and ripping at the plasterboard. Behind one side of the hallway she uncovered a skeleton. On the opposite side she uncovered another skeleton, slightly smaller than the last, both buried with all their toys and the hand-carved wooden animals that Eddie had seen on the wall. Michelle dragged the corpses out and down the stairs into the living room. She set them in the middle of the room. Eddie and Lucy were slowly lowered to the ground, and the 2 skeletons slowly lifted. Manifesting from behind the children a spirit. A woman. She was wet, twitching, bedraggled, but she bore a smile. She walked up to the 2 skeletons and took them by the hands. They started to move. Something started to grow inside their rib cages. It looked like a heart, then lungs. Other organs followed. Once the skeletons had filled out, they started to grow tendons, then muscle, then skin and clothing started to wrap itself around the lifeless corpses. When the children had regained their bodies and clothing, they landed and walked with their mother towards the doorway. The children looked back at Michelle. "Thank you." There was a bright light. Michelle was waking to a sense of peace. The quaking had stopped. Lucy and Eddie were back to normal, asleep on the sofa. The house was still cracked, and the holes in the hallway walls were still there. The skeletons had collapsed into piles of bones on the living room carpet. Jonathan's car was pulling up outside. When he saw the state of the house, he rushed in to make sure everyone was okay. He was met with a forced smile from Michelle on the floor, and Eddie and Lucy stirring from their sleep on their sofa. "What the hell happened here?" "You really don't want to know." "Daddy!" screamed the two children in unison. They both jumped off the sofa and flung their arms around him. He hugged them back. "Hey, you two. Can you wait here? Don't let the kids come upstairs." Michelle had suddenly realised about the holes in the walls. She wanted to take the deceased children's toys and bones and bury them in the garden near the river. She grabbed a couple of bags from the kitchen and went upstairs to collect the things. She bundled everything from the walls into the bags and took them downstairs and placed them next to the bones. She didn't realise that there had been a photo in with the stuff, and now it sat on top of the bag. She pulled it out, a photo of the mother, the children, and the father. "Hey, Michelle, what's going on?" Jonathan was stood in front of the fire, just like he was in the photo.
We hope you've enjoyed tonight's grisly tale. Please join us next time for another adventure into the dark unknown.
Thank you for listening to Tales from the Fireside, written by Rodeo Whiter and Dan Lee, and produced by RODEAX.